Today, we're taking a wild ride through the strange and downright bizarre medical practices that were used in North America, particularly in the USA and Mexico. Some of this stuff is hard to believe, but it's all part of our shared history, and it really shows how people throughout time have always been willing to go to extreme lengths in their search for healing. So let's get into it. Brace yourself, because some of these treatments are pretty wild. Before we get started, if you enjoy learning about history like this, don't forget to subscribe to Infinite Curiosity. I promise you'll find more stories that'll blow your mind. Let's start our journey way back in ancient Mexico with a practice called trepanation. Now imagine this, you've got a killer headache or maybe you're suffering from what they thought was some sort of mental illness. What's the solution? Drill a hole in your skull. Yep, you heard that right. They genuinely believed that drilling into someone's head could release evil spirits that were causing their suffering. This wasn't just a one-off idea either. It was super common in Mesoamerican cultures, including the Aztecs. But here's where it gets even crazier. Trepanation wasn't just about medical treatment, it had a spiritual angle too. Rituals were often performed alongside the procedure, with priests or shamans invoking the gods, asking them to help heal the person undergoing the treatment. And here's the mind-blowing part. Many people actually survived. When scientists study ancient skulls, they find evidence of healing around the holes, meaning the person lived for months or even years afterward. If you think about it, that's pretty remarkable considering the lack of modern surgical tools or antibiotics. Some skulls show multiple holes, suggesting people went through this more than once. While it sounds brutal, it was actually an attempt to treat serious problems, and it worked, at least sometimes. Trepanation wasn't exclusive to Mexico either. You'll find examples of it in ancient Greece, Egypt, and even in South American cultures like the Incas. But in Mexico, it was deeply tied to religious beliefs and healing rituals, making it part medical practice, part spiritual journey. Now let's hop forward in time and across the border to the USA in the 18th and 19th centuries where things weren't much better. Here, one of the go-to treatments for almost any illness was bloodletting. Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like, removing a patient's blood in the hopes of balancing the body's humors. Doctors back then believed in something called humoral theory, which claimed that the body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If any of these were out of balance, well, you got sick. So, they figured if you had too much blood, draining some of it should fix the problem, right? This wasn't just for little illnesses either. People were bled for everything from the common cold to serious conditions like pneumonia or high blood pressure. They used leeches to suck the blood out or made small cuts to let the blood drain out directly. And believe it or not, this was mainstream medicine for hundreds of years. Even George Washington, the first president of the USA, was treated this way. In fact, during his final illness, he was bled multiple times. Some historians think that all this blood loss may have contributed to his death. Looking back, it seems insane that doctors thought weakening a sick person by draining their blood was a good idea. But back then, people trusted their doctors, no matter how extreme the treatment. You've got to wonder how many people went along with these procedures because they were scared or desperate to feel better. And the doctors themselves, they truly believed they were helping. Around the same time over in Mexico, there was another medical practice that's just as shocking: the use of mercury to treat illnesses, especially syphilis. Now, syphilis was one of the most feared diseases of the time. It was incredibly common, and there was no known cure, so doctors turned to mercury. They prescribed it in all kinds of forms: ointments, pills, even vapor baths, where patients would sit and inhale mercury fumes. The idea was that mercury could purge the body of the bad humors associated with syphilis. But here's the problem. Mercury is incredibly toxic. Sure, it seemed to help in the short term, but the long-term effects were brutal. Patients would experience tremors, their teeth would fall out, and in some cases they would die. Despite this, mercury was used for centuries in both the USA and Mexico. It's one of those historical ironies. People were so desperate to cure one disease that they ended up poisoning themselves. And remember, back then, doctors genuinely believed they were offering the best treatment available. Now let's shift gears and talk about herbal remedies, which were a huge part of medical practices, especially among indigenous cultures in North America. Long before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes in both the USA and Mexico had extensive knowledge of local plants and their healing properties. These remedies weren't just about physical health, though. In many indigenous cultures, health was seen as a balance between the body, the mind, and nature. so healing often involved spiritual rituals as well. For example, sage was commonly used for cleansing and spiritual healing, while the yarrow plant was applied to wounds to stop bleeding and prevent infection. These remedies weren't just based on superstition either. Modern science has validated many of them. Take willow bark, for instance. It was used by Native Americans to relieve pain, and it turns out that it contains salicin, which is the active ingredient in aspirin. Indigenous healers were deeply respected within their communities, not just because they knew how to treat physical ailments, but because they also addressed spiritual health. It's interesting to see how different their approach was compared to the more clinical, science-based treatments brought by European settlers. But even today, we still use some of these ancient herbal remedies, proving that their knowledge wasn't just folklore, it had real medical value. Okay, so we've talked about ancient skull drills and toxic mercury, but things get even darker when we look at how mental illness was treated in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In both the USA and Mexico, asylums were built to house people with mental disorders, but the conditions inside were often horrifying. These places were more like prisons than hospitals. Patients were subjected to inhumane treatments like straitjackets, isolation, and cold water baths that were thought to calm them down. One of the most infamous treatments was the lobotomy, a surgical procedure where doctors would sever connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex. It was supposed to make patients more manageable, but it often left them with permanent brain damage. And this wasn't just happening in the USA. In Mexico, places like La Castaneda Asylum were notorious for overcrowding and brutal treatments. Patients were often restrained for days, and conditions were so bad that some never left the asylums alive. Despite all this, there were people who fought for better treatment. In the USA, a woman named Dorothea Dix led campaigns to reform asylums, and in Mexico, psychiatrist Rafael Lavista pushed for more humane treatment of patients. But real change didn't come until the mid-20th century, and even then, it was slow. Looking at all these practices, from drilling holes in skulls to bleeding people dry to poisoning them with mercury, it's clear that the road to modern medicine was long and full of bizarre, sometimes dangerous detours. It really makes you appreciate how far we've come, but also reminds us that people in the past were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. They were just as determined to find cures as we are today, even if some of their methods seem shocking to us now. So what's the weirdest medical practice from history you've ever heard of? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this dive into the strange history of medicine, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Curiosidad Infinita for more fascinating explorations of the past.